it about this? You haven't understood Elijah. And Matthew sets these stories up for us as Jesus begins his own walk to Jerusalem, where he knows, according to Matthew, quite clearly, the powers that be are going to turn against him, and he's going to die. And he doesn't run like Elijah did. And he doesn't grieve as Moses did. He simply turns his face to Jerusalem. And in the ultimate act of nonviolence, lives his life to its conclusion, true to who and what he is. Doesn't ask or demand anything from God. He simply follows. Metaphysical what am I looking for? Implication. Of the story. What's the story trying to tell us? What's the larger call of the story? Jesus on the mountaintop, transfigured, changed in his outward appearance, actually glowing with the presence of God. Peter, the disciple that represents faith, saying, this is it. This is why we're here. This is why we came to have this God experience. Let's build temples here. Let's stay here. Let's not leave this place. James, the disciple of discernment, of judgment. Jesus' holy judgment knows that this isn't why he came. This moment, this divine experience, is fuel for the journey, not the journey. It's John who most closely represents the journey. It's just love. The very lesson Elijah was taught in the cave. The lesson Moses finally got to as he stood on Horeb and looked over the Jordan River into a land that he could not enter. Both stopped in their tracks because of their anger, their judgment, their need to be right. The Christ consciousness within us. At some point we wake up and we realize that the rules by which we live our life, the externalities that we pursue, our thoughts of how the world works, what life is, no longer work for us. And we begin to believe that there's something more, something greater. We get a holy disquiet that says, the depth of our being, is this all it is? Is this all there is to life? And we have that burning bush experience. And we're faithful to that burning bush experience, and we follow it, and we begin to discover the spiritual laws on which life is based. And then there's part of our consciousness that wakes up, and it begins to beat us up. It begins to challenge our thoughts. And why aren't you this? And why aren't you that? And why aren't you Mother Teresa? And why can't you resolve this? And why do you have problems? And why aren't you faithful? And maybe the problem is you're not living like you need to live. And then the still small voice comes along and quiets that voice within us. It begs us to be loving and gentle with ourselves. Once we're loving and gentle with ourselves, then we can be loving and gentle with others. And then once we've gotten to that point, We've grown enough and created the field enough and open enough to love to begin to accept the fact of our own divine mission, our own Christ consciousness, the fact that we are the beloved, that we are sons and daughters, we are direct emanations from this spiritual presence that pervades all things. That we're here intended and on purpose. And in those moments of transfiguration, when that becomes really clear to us and we get it and we begin to see our whole spiritual evolution of our lives, and in those moments, those mountaintop experiences where we just get it, there's part of us that wants to stop and stay there and say, this is it. A moment of bliss for which I've come. But we know that's not true. We know yet and still there is something within us that must die. We know that the journey's not complete because there are still times when we relinquish the driver's seat to the ego and not to God. We know there are still times that we respond to the unruliness in ourselves and others, like Moses did by throwing the book at him, or like Elijah did by being angry and castigating and judging and challenging them to a duel. But those voices have to be reconciled within us. We've been transfigured, but not fully transformed. Transfiguration is not the point. Transformation is the full and complete death of the small s self. The surrender to that burning bush, the surrender to the still small voice, the surrender to that glowing cloud, the three images presented in this story in Matthew, is still in some ways conditional. Still in some ways narcissistic, still in some ways serving an ego self that cares more about what it drives than how it drives. Still an ego self that's just as likely to go back to the worship of gold as it is to an obedience to the law. Still an ego self that's ready to jump into judgment and condemnation and making people wrong. And following that still small voice and finding love and gentleness and peaceful coexistence. The work of nonviolence, which Jesus perfected, takes a lot of work. People think nonviolence is a wimpy solution. They think pacifists are fools. True pacifism requires a huge amount of courage. True pacifism requires real faith. It requires the ultimate belief that there is something beyond us, that nothing can happen to us except what that allows. True pacifism requires knowledge of the eternal. To walk into Jerusalem as Jesus did, to face judgment and anger and hostility, to die, required a surrender that our culture cannot do.